So we've taken our seat. We're ready for this Bible drama to unfold before us. So imagine as the lights start to dim and the curtain starts to rise, and there for the first time we see her, this Shulammite maiden. The first thing we notice about her, she's beautiful. Just absolutely breathtaking in appearance. The Shulammite maiden, the reason we refer to her that way is because this drama is set in a place called Shulem or Shunem. That's where she's from. And it's a beautiful place. There were a lot of important things scripturally that happened in Shulem. And it seems like, in addition to it being a beautiful place, a lot of attractive people were from Shulem. Like everyone who came from Shulem was attractive. There was one lady mentioned in the Bible who was a nurse. Her name was Abishag. She was from Shulem. And the Bible, in describing what she looked like physically, says that Abishag was beautiful to the extreme. So if that's the description in the script, she must have been just gorgeous to look at. So it's like everyone from Shulem was beautiful. So Shulem must have been a place kind of like St. Helena. Just everybody you meet. But we notice when we first see the Shulamite maiden, as beautiful as she is, she's in distress because she's not in Shulem. She's in custody. And so we wonder, why is this beautiful young lady in custody? What are the circumstances that have led to this situation? And so she starts to speak, but she says, in order to understand this, I've got to go all the way back to the beginning of this whole episode. She tells us it all started one day when she was out in an apple orchard, and she was just minding her own business there, but by chance, she met the shepherd boy. And so the two of them bump into each other, they meet, they start a conversation, and before you know it, they start a courtship. So a relationship is budding, and here's our first lesson. If you turn to chapter 2 in the Song of Solomon, we're going to read verse 9. So this young couple getting to know one another, and chapter 2, verse 9, the Shulamite maiden tells us, my dear one is like a gazelle, like a young stag. There he is standing behind our wall, gazing through the windows, looking through the lattices. Here's the first lesson. So this couple is courting. The shepherd boy he wants to see, the Shulamite maiden. So does he go to her house? He goes to visit her at her home. It's important because there at her house, her brothers were there. Her mother would be there. And so while they would give them some privacy, in that safe environment, this young couple could get to know one another. Well, there they are, and as they're visiting, a turn of events takes place. Notice in verse 10, she says, as he was there, the shepherd boy, she said, my dear one speaks. He says to me, rise up, my beloved, my beautiful one, come away with me. Well, where was he inviting her to go? Well, if you continue reading here in chapter 2, he explains that it's the first of spring. And we look forward after the wintertime and everything is cold and rainy. We look forward to springtime because the weather's beautiful like it was today. Sun is shining, the birds are singing, the flowers are in bloom. And he says, on this beautiful spring day, what are we doing inside? He says, why don't the two of us just go for a long stroll in the countryside? And when she hears this proposal, well, it sounds appealing to her. So she says, well, okay, well, before we go, though, let me just go mention this to my brothers to let them know where I'll be at. Now, note with interest her brother's reaction. Look back in chapter 1, verse 6. So all she's doing is just informing them that she's been invited to go on a stroll in the countryside. And chapter 1, verse 6, she says, do not stare at me because I am swarthy, because the sun has gazed upon me. The sons of my mother were angry with me. They appointed me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I did not keep. So the question is, why did they react that way? Why would her brothers get angry? If all she did was just inform them that she'd been invited to go on a nice little stroll in the countryside. So let's consider some possibilities. Were they angry because they thought their sister was immoral? No, that wasn't it. Were they angry because they thought she had some sort of impure motives? No. Well, was it because they didn't trust the shepherd boy that she's courting? That wasn't it either. They loved their sister and they thought the best of this young man. So why would they get angry then? Well, they simply took this precautionary measure with their sister, just forbidding her to go on this walk alone in the countryside, because they knew that this could lead to a tempting situation for them. See, two people secluded, and their hearts are already compromised. They're falling for one another, and if they were alone, her brothers just imagined what could happen, and they said, "We will not allow you to go." Well, there are a couple of lessons that we can learn from this. Now, first of all, the Shulamite maiden, she's an adult. So her brother said, "No, you won't go." And she cooperated with them. She agreed. So she respected the authority of her brothers. It might make us think for a moment about how we feel toward those who have been given authority over us. See, do we respect and cooperate with their authority? So who's been given authority over us? Well, if we're a young person in the congregation, that's our parents. So is it always easy to cooperate with our parents? It's obvious. The answer is no. Especially when our parents are asking us to do things we really don't want to do, or we don't understand why they're asking. But when we cooperate with our parents, it makes them happy and it pleases Jehovah. Now, in the congregation setting, who's been given authority over us? Well, it's the elders. Not that the elders are masters over our faith. We're all brothers. But in the setting of the congregation, Jesus has given us these gifts, men. Now, the elders, all of us are imperfect, so it's not difficult to see weaknesses and flaws. We don't have to look hard to see mistakes that the elders make. But this shouldn't in any way undermine our appreciation and respect for the authority that they have. See, Jehovah trusts them, so we should trust them. And if we're struggling, I mean, at times we do, because we see each other's imperfections, and sometimes we can struggle with being cooperative from the heart. If that's the case, we just need to pray about it and then work at being cooperative. And especially if we're struggling with one individual, maybe something has happened or we're just having difficulty with an individual, we need to pray not about the individual, we need to pray for the individual. So if we pray for someone, it's very difficult to remain upset with them if we're praying for them. And if it continues to be a struggle, well, we just continue praying, and Jehovah helps to adjust our viewpoint. Well, her brothers won't let her go on this walk in the countryside, and more than that, they figure that if you've even got time to think about something like this, you don't have enough to do. So we're going to give you some work to do, her brothers say. Now look at the end of verse 6. We read this. She says that her brothers appointed her the keeper of the vineyards. Now, in Bible times, when you would plant a vineyard, you had to watch it because foxes would get into it and eat up all the fruitage if you weren't careful. So her job was to patrol these vineyards during the heat of the day to make sure foxes didn't get in it. So right at the end of that, though, after she said they gave her this job to do, she says, "But my own vineyard I did not keep." Now that's important because it tells us a lot about her. Sometimes we think of her like she's like a teenager, like a young girl, Shulammite maiden, but she's not. She's not. What she tells us here indicates something about her maturity. See, she says she owns her own vineyard. And in fact, She has enough business savvy that she owns this vineyard. It's her own business. She doesn't even have to go work in her. See, she says, I've got other people that keep it for me. So she's mature. And she's ready to start this courtship that could lead to marriage. So if we're a young person, here's another lesson we might consider. If we're a young person, or maybe we're not a young person, but if we're considering marriage, if that's in our future potentially, marriage, how do we know when we're ready? How do we know? Well, a lot of factors to consider. Let's discuss just 3 of them. Here's the first one. How well do we handle money? Now you might be thinking, what does money have to do with marriage? A lot, right? Because as a single person, if we're struggling with money, if we're always in debt, if we're struggling to pay off our debt, if we don't really have a plan, we don't have a budget, well, it's like driving blindfolded, isn't it? So if we're struggling to manage money as a single person, how do you think we're going to fare when we're trying to manage a household? See, so it's a lot better if we learn and develop some money management skills on this side of marriage. See, that'll equip us. Here's a second factor to consider, our own personality. So we have to know ourselves. And this is a challenge for all of us because we cannot see ourselves the way others see us. None of us can. So that's why it's important that we have a good friend. A friend who won't just tell us what we want to hear, but will tell us the truth. See, that's a good friend. And so with one of our good friends, we have to ask them, if we're considering marriage in our future, we ask them to tell me a little about what you've observed in me. Now, I don't want to hear just all good things. Tell me about my weaknesses. See, how do I act when I'm under pressure? Which aspect of the fruitage of the Spirit, if you had to pick one, which one could I work on the most? And then if we ask the question, then we can't be upset when we hear the answer. Because they could reveal that we have work to do when it comes to our personality. And so we just accept it and then try to work on it. And if we do, it will equip us to be better. We'll be better equipped when we're married. Now here's the third thing, and this is the most important factor we could ever discuss in connection with preparation for marriage. It's spirituality. Spirituality. And spirituality is one of these words that's thrown around so often. Many people have no idea what spiritual is. Sometimes in the ministry we'll be talking with our neighbors and they'll say, well, I'm not a religious person, but I'm a spiritual person. Most have no idea what true spirituality is. The Bible's definition of spirituality has to do with our viewpoint. You remember the Apostle Paul? He described the difference between, on one hand, a spiritual person and a physical person. And Paul said it's all about how they view things. See, a spiritual person, when it comes to spiritual things, Bible's reading and study, meditation, our relationship with Jehovah, a spiritual person, that's the most important thing in our life. But for the physical person, that's foolish. It's a waste of time. See, spiritual people view things through the lens of Jehovah's thinking. So we try to think as much like Jehovah as we can. And the Bible says that as we work to develop spirituality, we can have the mind of Christ. That means we can learn to think like Jesus thinks. And if we learn to think like Jesus thinks, then we'll act like Jesus acts. That's true spirituality. And so if we're considering marriage in our future, what kind of spirituality do I have? How do we know? How do I feel about reading the Bible? How do I view attending the meetings? My participation in the ministry? My prayers? See, those are some indicators that may reveal something about the depth of our spirituality. Well, the Shulammite maiden, she could go through that checklist and she's ready. She's a mature woman, so she's ready to pursue this courtship. But you remember now her brothers have given her this busy work to do, so it's thrown her schedule off. And so things that she would normally take care of, now maybe they're pushed back into later in the day. So after she finishes patrolling the vineyards one day, she has to run an errand. And her errand takes her away from her home and the vineyards. She goes to this area where they have a lot of walnut trees. Now, we don't know exactly why she went there, but she's just taking care of some business. It could have been because in Bible times they took walnuts and they would boil walnuts. Can you imagine that? Boil? Now, it's not like the way y'all boil peanuts, though. They wouldn't eat them. They would boil them. They would boil these walnuts, and then they would throw fabric into this mixture, and it would make this beautiful dark brown dye. Walnuts. They would also take walnuts in Bible times and take the meat out of the walnut and press it, and it would produce oil, walnut oil. And it's almost as good as olive oil is. Maybe that's why she went there. We don't know. But when she was there at this forest of walnut trees, something happened to her that changed the course of her life. So what was it that happened? Well, she tells us. So if you turn back with me to chapter 6. Now remember, she's just minding her own business. She's not looking to get involved in any difficulty. She's just running this errand. Notice what happens to her, though. Chapter 6, we'll start with verse 11. She says, I went down to the garden of nut trees to see the new growth in the valley, to see whether the vine had sprouted, whether the pomegranate trees had blossomed. Before I knew it, she says, before I knew it, my desire had put me at the chariots of my noble people. So there she is, minding her own business. And verse 12, she says, it was completely accidental. I didn't mean to do it. But while she was running this errand, she accidentally stumbled upon King Solomon on vacation. And it was a sight unlike anything she had probably ever seen in her life. Because you remember King Solomon, he's the richest man in the world. So anything he wants, he can afford. So his vacations are not like, like after we take a vacation and we go back and look through the pictures, his vacations are not like our vacations. When Solomon would vacation, he would have hundreds of servants that would accompany him wherever he wanted to go. And he'd decide, I want to stop here. And so these servants would stop and they would erect these magnificently beautiful black tents. They were made out of goat's hair. And that's where Solomon would live. And maybe he slept in one tent and ate in another tent and another tent for entertainment and whatever he thought might amuse him. Singers and musicians and dancers. They all went along for his vacation. So the Shulamite maiden, she just minded her own business, and she just happens to stumble upon this area where Solomon is vacationing. Now, because he's the king, he has a security force, these mighty men who travel wherever he goes. So perhaps one of these mighty men, as they were patrolling this area, recognizes, sees this Shulamite maiden, and before she knows it, they snatch her and take her into custody. And she's protesting. I'm just running an errand and I need to get back home, and they won't even respond to her. So these guards take her down into Solomon's camp. She's hurried into one of these tents and under guard. So she's in custody and she can't get out. She can't even let her brothers know what's happened to her. So these security guards go into Solomon and they tell him, Solomon, you've got to come out. You've got to see this, because we met the most beautiful woman in the world today. Now, why would Solomon have been especially interested in that? You remember how he felt about beautiful women? It's like that was his weakness. That was his Achilles heel. And Jehovah had warned Solomon that he needed to be careful about accumulating these foreign wives. Jehovah said, they're going to draw you away from me. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. But Solomon, that's his weakness. And he hears about this beautiful woman. And so where is she? Where is she? So they bring her in and present her to him. And Solomon, he's almost speechless. He's never seen a woman so beautiful. But he has to come up with something. He has to say something to try to impress her. So here's what he says. If you turn with me back to chapter 1. Now remember, he's kind of caught off guard by this. And he's seen a lot of women, but never one just so naturally beautiful. So he tries to think up something complimentary to say to her. Look at chapter 1, please, verse 9. Now this is Solomon speaking to the Shulamite maiden. He tells her, he says, I liken you, my beloved, to a mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of beads. We will make for you gold ornaments studded with silver. So go back to verse 9. So what's and this is in all sincerity, he's trying to pay her a compliment. What does he compare her to? You pick up on that? He says, boy, when I look at you, it's like I'm looking at a horse. And wait a minute, that doesn't sound like a compliment. But then you have to look deeper than that. See, it wasn't just any old horse. He said he compared her to one of these mares among the chariots of Pharaoh. And these were like the choicest of horses. And historians say that these horses, when you would just hear the sound of them galloping, that Pharaoh's opponents would just cower in fear just from the sound of these horses. What he's really saying to her in complimenting is that when I look at you, I see strength, because horses are just magnificent and strong animals. But at the same time, they're very almost like ballerinas. They're so graceful. So he's saying, I see strength and grace and beauty all wrapped up into one. Now it sounds better. That's what he really meant to say. But right after this compliment, now he just met her. You notice what he starts to offer in verse 11. Just met the woman. He says, we'll make gold ornaments and studded with silver for her. He's not offering her a little gold ring. It's the richest man in the world. So he's telling her, you never have to worry about money another day in your life. What would you have said to an offer like that? Well, it does make us stop and think about how we feel about money and the real snare of materialism. Hey, if we're not careful, we can just be sucked into a materialistic attitude. And this world, this entire system of things controlled by Satan, is designed to just keep people chasing after unrealities. And if we're not careful, we could fall prey. I'll share an experience with you. This was from 1988 in Jamaica. 1988, one of our sisters and her son heard a report over the weather radio that a hurricane was coming, Hurricane Gilbert. So they suggested that everyone flee their homes and take shelter. So that's exactly what she did without any delay. And she didn't take anything with her. She just left her home, grabbed her son. They went to this secure place. And the hurricane hit the island. So she went back after the storm had passed to where her home had stood. So she went back just to see if she could salvage anything left in the rubble that she could preserve it. So she's looking around, and you can imagine the mess. Everything is just soaked, and but there she found something. So she picked it up. Just then, the winds start up again. So her son, without even thinking about it, as soon as the wind started, her son takes off running back toward the shelter where they had been. But he looks back and his mother hasn't moved. So this young boy, he yells back to his mother, "Mom, put the television down. Are you the wife of Lot?" That sister later, as she recalled that situation, she said, my son saved my life. Because she was just paralyzed. This emotional attachment to this thing left her just like she was standing in cement. She couldn't move. And you start to think about this. What would she have done with the television? A rain-soaked television. No electricity on the island. But it was just the emotional attachment. And all of us, we can have that kind of attachment to things. And we have to be careful that we don't allow our hearts to become attached to things. We need to be attached to people, to Jehovah, to our brothers. But if we're not careful, the world is just, you'll be happier if you have this possession. Your life will be better if you have this thing. And then once we acquire things, it's always the next thing. As soon as we get something, it's obsolete. So we have to get the newest and the latest. There's nothing wrong with having nice things. It's about what we're pursuing. See, and what our hearts are attached to. So this Shulamite maiden, this offer of gold and silver, it just in one ear, out the other. Because she has everything she needs. She's got this nice relationship going. She has her own vineyard back home. And she's got a solid relationship with Jehovah. So she's not even thinking about doing anything to jeopardize that. So she just rejects him. And this is a shock for Solomon because he's the king. And people don't say no to the king. So he's not going to give up. He figures, well, maybe the reason that she's not impressed with me is because she's not seeing me at my best. I'm on vacation. So he decides to end the vacation. So all the tents come down and the entertainers and the cooks and the music, everything has to be packed up, and they start this 50-mile trip all the way back to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, what do you think her brothers are thinking about her? Now, she left, and when she left home, she said, I'm just going to run an errand. I'm going to go down to the walnut tree. I'll be right back. And now it's been days that have passed, and what happened to her? They have no idea. So they get back to Jerusalem, and Solomon has a beautiful palace in Jerusalem. So that's where she's housed. The temple is there in Jerusalem. And so she goes to bed one night, and while she's sleeping, she has a dream. And it's not just any ordinary dream. It's a dream that's so vivid and so real that when she awakes from this dream, she's not even sure that it was a dream. You ever had a dream? Like where you fall asleep and it's just, you're dreaming, but when you wake up and your heart is pounding, now did that just happen or was that a dream? She has a dream like that. And what was the dream about? And more importantly, what lesson can we learn from her dream? Well, she relates the dream to us. If you turn to chapter 5. Now, it's no wonder who she dreams about, because she started up this courtship, and she's lovesick. So she dreams about the shepherd boy. And in her dream, notice it starts in verse 2. She says, I'm asleep, but my heart is awake. And in her dream, it's the middle of the night, but the shepherd boy, he comes over and he knocks on the door. He says at the end of verse 2, he says, open to me. And at verse 3, in her dream, the Shulamite maiden, she says, no. I've already put on my bedclothes. It's the middle of the night. I prepared for bed. No, it's too late. I'm not getting up. Verse 4 tells us that the shepherd boy leaves. But then, you notice right at the end of verse 4, and this is an important point. She says, and my feelings for him were stirred. Evidently to this point, she's been thinking and reasoning, but now all of that is out the window. She's emotionally involved. So now she's going to make some decision just based on how she feels. Well, notice what happens next in her dream. So she gets up in verse 5. She runs over to the door. She opens it, but he's gone. So what does she do? Well, verse 6. She feels despair. So he left. I have to find him. So she starts looking for him. So she leaves her home and she's out in the middle of the night looking for him. So around this corner, she can't find him. Around that corner, can't find him. The end of verse 6, she starts calling for him. Now, because this is just dictated by her emotion, her feeling, her heart, in verse 7, the watchmen, this is like the police force in the city, the watchmen are just making their rounds at night, and they see this woman. And at first, they can't believe what they're witnessing. From a distance, they see this, they can make her out in the moonlight to this beautiful woman, but she's just making decisions based on emotion. So guess what she forgot to do before she left home? She didn't get dressed. So she's out in the night with nothing on. She maybe just a shawl just wrapped around her. The watchmen, they see her and can you believe this? This beautiful woman out in the middle of the night, nothing on, and she's calling out for a man. Now what do you imagine they thought she was up to? So in her dream, they don't even ask her any questions. Notice what happens. You look down at the end of verse 7. These watchmen, they strike her, so they just take their batons and start beating her, assaulting her. She says, they wounded me. The watchmen of the walls took my shawl away from me, and then she wakes up. Boy, that was more like a nightmare than a dream, wasn't it? What do we learn from it? What does it all mean? Well, you remember her brothers, they were trying their best to just protect their sister, just to keep her from getting into a situation that might lead to temptation. And in this dream, that's exactly what happens. That's exactly what happens. The Bible tells us very clearly, very straightforward, that our heart is desperate and treacherous. So imagine if I was introducing you to someone. I said, I'd like you to meet this person, and let me tell you a little bit about him. Now, the first thing you should know is this person is desperate. And in addition, you should also know treacherous. Now, how close would you get to this person? You would probably, as soon as you met them, you'd probably turn and go the other way. But see, that's what the Bible describes. Our heart is desperate and treacherous. So we cannot make decisions based on it felt right. We just can't. We'll lead ourselves into disaster. Instead, we have to allow Jehovah's thinking to become our thinking. So we have to read his word each day and meditate on what we read, so that Jehovah's thoughts can become our thoughts. And then the decisions that we make, see, we're truly trusting in Jehovah. We're leaning on him for direction. We're allowing him to guide us. He expects us to use our own thinking faculties. But we just can't make decisions based on our heart. It felt right. It seemed like the right thing to do. So maybe that's the lesson she learns from this dream. And now she's just telling herself, how can I get out? How can I escape? I need to get back home. My brothers, my mother are worried sick about me. But before she's allowed to go, Solomon comes in now. This is his last attempt. And since he's at home, his palace in Jerusalem, he probably is decked out. Maybe a beautiful purple robe. And he's got his crown on with gems and all around it, and a ring on every finger. And so he walks in, this flowing robe behind him. Now here's what he says. This is his last attempt. If you turn with me to chapter 6 again. Chapter 6. And we'll read verses 8 and 9. He says to the Shulamite maiden, he says, there may be 60 queens and 80 concubines and young women without number. But only one is my dove, my flawless one. So what does he say to her to try to win her affection? Well, look again at verse 8. Now at this point, this is early in Solomon's reign. You remember by the end, he'd accumulated like 700 wives and 300 concubines. But But this is early, so he says to her, now it's true, I can't deny it, I've got 60 wives. And it's also, there's no way around it, I have 80 concubines. But you know what? They don't mean anything to me. You're the one. It doesn't even sound right, does it? So the Shulamite, she hears this and she just sees right through this. It's not a temptation to her. The lesson we draw from that is one of the beautiful things about being in the truth, being part of Jehovah's organization, is that Jehovah teaches us to see things and even to see people as they are. So we're not quickly fooled. Someone, their speech may be very smooth and persuasive, but because Jehovah trains us, he helps us to just, and the way we do it is we keep reading the Bible, and so we're exposed to Jehovah's thinking. So when we come up with a situation or a person, we just try to match it up. Does this match with what the Bible teaches? And if it doesn't match, we don't even get involved in it. So Jehovah helps us to see things as they are. So we're not tricked or duped or easily persuaded to just follow people, even if their speech sounds very persuasive. Because the world is filled with people who take advantage of others. But Jehovah trains us so that we don't have to. So she's not impressed at all. And her fortitude and her strength, the strength of her character, to Solomon, it makes her even more attractive. But he realizes she's not going to budge. So finally, he consents to release her. And as soon as she does, well, what do you know? The shepherd boy, he's made his way there to Jerusalem, and he's caught up with her. So she's released, the two are reunited, and they start this 50-mile trip all the way back to home, all the way back to Shulem. So as they travel, you can imagine the conversation, and she's explaining everything that's happened to her. And he just tells, boy, it just makes me love you more to hear about your this entire situation and how you dealt with it. How were you able to stand up to the temptation? And it was love, she says. My love for Jehovah and my love for you. And so they're making their way back home, and they just about there. And she says to him, you remember the first time we met? And he says, of course I do. Well, where was it? And he says, it was the apple orchard. And yeah, you're right. And he tells her, you know, something I didn't tell you about that day is why I was there. And she said, well, why were you there? He says, well, where we met, that's where I was born. And she said, what do you mean that's where you were born? Right in front of that tree where we met. That's where my mother had me. And she says, I had no idea. So he said, now that's a special place. That's where I was born and where I met you. And boy, I'll never forget that place. So they're almost back home, and her brothers, who have been worried every day, they've been standing out on the terrace and just looking down the walkway to see if their sister might be headed. And so this day, they see someone, and they can't make out exactly who it is, but it appears to be like a husband and wife coming up the path. And who is this? So back in chapter 8, the brothers' conversation is recorded for us, and it's interesting that now they can't even really make out who it is, but it appears to be a woman. And she gets closer and closer, and they realize this is our sister. She's alive. And so they embrace her, and are you okay? What's happened? And she explains, I'm fine. I was taken into custody all the way to Jerusalem with King Solomon. And their heads are just spinning trying to keep up with this account she's relating. And her brothers, as she's talking to them, they start to see her differently. And they think, maybe we underestimated our sister. Because before they just viewed her like a little girl. She's our little sister. But now they see her for who she really is, this mature spiritual woman. And maybe that's the last lesson for us tonight. Sometimes, in the setting of a congregation like ours, when we have young people in the congregation and young adults, boy, it's really a pleasure to have little ones and to see young people grow up in the congregation. I remember enjoying the pleasure of being in the same congregation for 25 years. 25 years. So from the time I was 4, we moved to this congregation, and so the brothers and sisters there heard me give my first talk, in the theocratic ministry school, and saw me go out and field service with my little bag, and my little bow tie. But sometimes what happens, and we don't mean to do it, we really don't. When young ones grow up in the congregation, if we have these memories, and we like to just hold memories, and we don't like things to change. But before we know it, we look up, and the 4-year-olds are now 14 years old. That ever happened to you? And you wonder, how did this happen? Children just grow up so quickly. Then the 14-year-olds are 20 years old. And it just happens so fast. We don't mean it, but sometimes we'll still treat the young adults like they're little children. And they generally don't say anything about it, but inside they cringe when we talk to them like they're 4 and they're 20. So it's not fair to them to do that. So we have to let them grow up. And just try to see them like Jehovah sees them. Let them take their place in the congregation. And we listen to the young ones and their expressions, and it's obvious that they have developed their own spirituality. That's how Jehovah views them. So we can't keep treating them like little children. We have to just allow them, brothers, take their place, and they'll be the ministerial servants and elders here in the congregation. Young sisters, and they'll take responsibility. And some young sisters will go off to this Bible school for kingdom evangelizers, maybe. But we just have to treat them with dignity and the respect that's due to them. So after the Shulamite maiden, she explains everything to her brothers, and she gets done. Her brothers, in unison, they say to her, "Now, if you are waiting for us to give you our blessing, for you and the shepherd boy to be married, wait no longer." And a big smile beams across her face, and without any hesitation, she and the shepherd boy go off and start making preparations for their wedding, and the curtain comes down on this Bible drama.